Good evening and welcome. Tonight, we journey into the heart of an old American legend, into a land of dark water, hanging moss and whispers that refuse to fade with time. This is a story about fear, suspicion, and a curse spoken in anger. A tale of a woman hunted through the swamp, and a promise that death would not silence her. Some say it is only folklore. Others believe the ground itself still remembers. Near the quiet town of Yazoo City, the swamps stretch wide and endless, thick with cypress trees and black water that reflects the sky like a broken mirror. The air there feels heavy, as if it carries secrets too old to be spoken aloud. Even in daylight, the swamp seems dim sunlight filtered through, Spanish moss that hangs like funeral veils. At the edge of that wilderness once stood a small, collapsing cabin. It leaned into the mud as though the earth were slowly swallowing it. Inside lived an old woman, alone, rarely seen in town. No one remembered when she first appeared. No one could recall hearing her voice. They called her the Witch of Yazoo when fishermen began vanishing and bodies were later discovered, tangled in the roots of trees. Fear spread quickly. Each corpse wore the same expression, eyes wide, mouths open, frozen in silent terror. The townsfolk needed someone to blame, and the woman in the swamp was already half a ghost in their minds. Deputy Thomas Reed did not believe in witches. He believed in evidence. But as he stood knee-deep in murky water, examining yet another body pulled from the reeds, doubt crept into his thoughts. The victim's skin bore strange markings then, deliberate cuts forming symbols he did not recognize. Then he saw it, a narrow trail of footprints leading deeper into the swamp, small, bare, fresh. And as the evening fog thickened, he felt something watching him from beyond the trees. It was not a sound, not quite a shape, just a presence, pressing against his instincts like a cold hand at the back of his neck. Deputy Thomas Reed remained still, listening. The swamp had fallen unnaturally quiet. No insects, no frogs, only the slow ripple of dark water brushing against submerged roots. He told himself it was imagination. Fear was contagious in small towns, and Yazoo City had been infected for weeks. Thomas signaled the two men accompanying him to remain behind. He moved forward alone, boots sinking into mud that seemed reluctant to release him. The footprints ahead were unmistakable, bare, narrow, almost delicate. They weaved between cypress trunks and disappeared briefly where the ground dipped beneath shallow water, only to reappear again farther in. No one could walk this swamp barefoot, not without bleeding. The deeper he ventured, the colder the air became. A faint smell drifted toward him, burnt herbs, perhaps, or something older, metallic and bitter. Then he saw it, a cabin. It emerged slowly from the mist, more shadow than structure. Wood warped with age, windows dark as empty eye sockets. A crude charm hung. Above the door, twisted branches bound with string and feathers that had long since lost their color. Thomas approached cautiously. The door was slightly open. Inside, the air was thick with smoke. Dried plants hung from the ceiling. Small bones, animal bones, he told himself, were arranged in deliberate patterns across a wooden table. And carved into the surface, over and over again, was the same symbol he had seen cut into the victim's skin. He stepped closer. The floor creaked behind him. Slowly, he turned. The doorway was no longer empty. A thin silhouette stood against the gray light of the swamp, motionless, almost blending with the fog behind her. For a moment, Thomas could not tell whether she was truly there or merely a trick of shadow and fear. Then she stepped forward. She was smaller than he expected, frail. Her hair, long and white, hung loose around a face lined deeply by age and something harder to name. Her eyes, however, were not weak. They were sharp, watching, measuring him as carefully as he had measured the corpses pulled from the water. Thomas felt the weight of the revolver at his hip, but did not reach for it. He forced his voice steady, announcing his name, his badge, his purpose. The woman did not answer. She simply tilted her head slightly, as if listening to something beyond him, something moving in the swamp. The air inside the cabin shifted. Smoke from the dying embers on the hearth curled unnaturally, spiraling toward the ceiling in tight, deliberate shapes. Thomas's gaze drifted to the carved symbols on the table, then back to the woman's hands. Her fingers were stained dark. Not dirt, not quite ash. Behind him, outside the cabin, came a sudden shout. One of the men he had left at the edge of the trail. It was cut short, replaced by a splash, violent, desperate. Thomas spun toward the sound, heart pounding. The woman did not move to stop him as he rushed outside. But as he crossed the threshold, he heard it at last, her voice. Low, calm, certain. She spoke only a few words, barely louder than breath, yet they settled into his bones like a sentence already passed. She said that the swamp had taken what it was owed, and it would take more. When Thomas reached the water's edge, only ripples remained, and from somewhere deeper in the trees, something began to laugh. It was not loud, not wild, but thin and distant, stretched across the water like a thread pulled too tight. The sound carried through the cypress trunks and vanished into the fog, leaving Thomas frozen at the shoreline. The ripples where his deputy had stood moments earlier were already fading, swallowed by the dark surface of the swamp. He called out, wading into the water despite the cold gripping his legs. There was no answer, no struggle, no sign that a grown man had just been dragged beneath. Only the slow drift of algae and the reflection of a sky, turning the color of bruised iron. By the time Thomas returned to the cabin, it was empty. The hearth had gone cold. The bones were gone. The carved symbols remained, but the table itself felt older somehow, as if it had not been touched in years. Even the air had changed. Whatever presence had filled the room was now scattered into the swamp. Word of the disappearance spread through Yazoo City by morning. Fear hardened into anger. A search party formed before noon, men with rifles, lanterns, and the kind of courage that grows from collective panic. They no longer spoke of superstition. They spoke of justice. Thomas led them back into the swamp. This time, they found her waiting. The old woman stood outside the cabin, hands at her sides, unmoving as the armed men surrounded her. She did not plead. She did not run. Her gaze settled on Thomas alone, and in it he saw neither madness nor confusion, only certainty. The men bound her wrists and dragged her toward town. As they pulled her from the edge of the swamp, she finally spoke clearly, her voice cutting through the murmurs. She warned them that if they spilled her blood, the earth itself would reject her, and when she returned, she would not return alone. The words followed them out of the swamp like a shadow that refused to fall behind. By nightfall, the old woman stood at the edge of town, bound to a thick cypress, post driven into the earth just beyond the cemetery of Yazoo City. Torches flickered in restless hands. Faces once familiar now looked hardened, stripped of doubt by fear. Thomas Reed stood among them, unease tightening in his chest. This had moved too quickly. There had been no trial, no evidence beyond suspicion and panic. Yet the bodies in the water, the vanished deputy, the symbols carved into flesh, these images burned too fiercely in memory for reason to prevail. The fire was lit. Flames climbed hungrily, devouring dry wood, then fabric, then the thin silhouette at its center. Smoke twisted upward into the dark sky. Through the roar of burning timber, her voice rose one final time, not screaming, not pleading, but declaring. She cursed them. She swore that within 20 years the town would burn, that the river would rise, that the ground would remember what they had done. When the fire died, only ash remained. They buried what was left in the town cemetery, sealing the grave with a heavy iron cage and extra precaution. They said, against superstition. Thomas watched in silence as the earth closed over her. Years passed. Then, almost exactly 2 decades later, a great fire tore through Yazoo City. Flames consumed homes, businesses, and churches in a single relentless sweep. The wind drove the blaze toward the cemetery, and there, inexplicably, it stopped. In the aftermath, townsfolk swore they saw something else. The iron cage above the old woman's grave had twisted, bent outward from within. No one ever proved the curse was real. No one found the missing deputy. But even now, the grave remains caged in iron. And on certain nights, when the swamp grows quiet, the earth around it seems to breathe.